Right, so there in fact is the link to, if you want any of the resources already from this session, want to follow along. I originally developed this kind of as almost a semi-workshop. It's not going to quite work out that way, but in any case, some of the command line stuff is a little small, so all the resources are there if you want. Welcome to AutoPkg Level-Up. And for some of you who subscribe to this session in, I guess around here you call it sked.com, thanks for the feedback. I really thought I could do a session that could go from the beginner to the advanced when I found out I was the only AutoPkg session all week, and that surprised me. So I had this really sexy demo where I had AutoPkgr on one side of the screen and terminal output on the other side of the screen, and it was fantastic. And I couldn't get my test runs of the presentation under 90 minutes. That's a problem. No matter how hard I tried, it was still 90 minutes, sometimes even grew. So then I asked for your help through that sked.com reference. I asked which topics were the most important to you, and thanks for the great response. I had responses within 30 minutes. That was fantastic. So I decided to emphasize the topics that are going to be most relevant to the people who replied, even though clearly, as much as I wanted to, I couldn't do it all. Having said that, when I talk at a conference like this, I still want to talk to the people in the room. If there's benefit for people watching the video afterwards, that's great. But just a show of hands, how many people in the room have never used or only barely toyed with AutoPkg or AutoPkgr? Okay, that gives me a good idea of where I might need to slow down a bit. That's fine. How many of you are using AutoPkgr but have tried to avoid the command line at this point? Okay, this is what the session was originally built for, and you people, you'll have no problem with this. This should help out. How many of you have only used, as far as recipes go, you've only used other people's recipes? You haven't written any yourself? Okay, how many of you have written your own recipes, even if they're just copies of other people's and you just tweaked a couple things? Okay, so I got 3, and of those of you, how many of you have a recipe repo in GitHub on the project? Okay, you can help answer questions at the end. So, with that mix of audience, I want to spend a minute to talk about what AutoPkg is and all the terminology we use. For those of you who've seen me present otherwhere, you know, I'm a bit of a pedagogue in that way. I like to make sure we're using terminology because sometimes we swap terminologies. Good, luckily enough, AutoPkg is well described on the homepage for the project on GitHub. And you'll notice there's 2 focuses, or foci if you prefer. The first one is automation, doing stuff that you would normally do manually in a repeatable and consistent fashion. And the other one is preparation. I know the thing that really sold me on AutoPkg was essentially the retrieval of third-party updates. But the fact that you can post-process, build packages, even customize things, again, eliminating manual steps, would be a really good thing. So I've already mentioned AutoPkgr, and so I want to make sure that everyone's clear what the difference is between the two. Because sometimes the problem we get in the MacAdmins Slack channel is people conflate the two, and we sometimes have to ask the question back, are you talking AutoPkg or AutoPkgr? You'll often see the R capitalized just to clarify. And I think this is the best comparison I can come with. Yeah, I know, I lost on the monitor too. So while they fix that, let me just talk through it. AutoPkg is the command line core that does everything. What AutoPkgr does is it's actually a GUI on top of AutoPkg. So you don't need AutoPkgr to run AutoPkg, but you do need AutoPkg to run AutoPkgr. What do you want me to do? Just unplug it and plug it back in again? Yeah. Have you tried turning it on and off again?
Check your config.sys.
It's an iPad. Yeah, okay, let's try this again. Yeah, no, it's out of sync. You understand, I ran this talk last night. Oh, hey, we got something, yay. And it was like, I got to 6 minutes under. Tech fails weren't in the plan. Okay, there you go. The thing is that AutoPkg was a product of the MacBrained meetup in the Bay Area. They did a Hack the Mac night. Actually, it was over a period of time, and this was what came out of it. This was the winning one in 2014, to add a GUI on top. But it also does a couple of other things that's useful that people like. It's easier to set up, or not easier, but it's dead simple to set up AutoPkg using AutoPkg. There's 2 buttons on the front screen, you click them, and those were part of my demo that died, that I couldn't add because of time. But it's dead simple to install. In fact, people sitting here, the stuff's small enough, you could probably install it on the fly on the Mac that's in front of you. As well, you have, it allows automated scheduled runs, like I want to run this list of recipes once a day. It allows notifications, so for example, in mine, I have it email to me when it's downloaded and or packaged something new. You can have notifications through Slack if you prefer, or even OS 10 notifications. But on the command line side, the core AutoPkg project, there are more run options that allow you to do things, including, for example, running a package recipe with something you've already downloaded. Particularly useful for testing, but I'll describe another case later if I have time. And you can get, if you're trying to write recipes, you can get info about the core of what AutoPkg does is it runs processors. The other thing that was added in 2016 was trust verification. The development of AutoPkg stopped before trust verification was a feature of it. If any of you are, can code in Objective-C and want to pick up the project, the community will love you for it. But right now, AutoPkg is in active development, AutoPkg is not. So that's one of the reasons I hope some of the equivalencies I'm going to talk about will be useful to you. If you're using AutoPkg at the command line, it's a very simple concept. You just type in AutoPkg, then a verb, what you want to do, and then options, often, for example, a recipe name or a flag. And here's some common examples. The best one, of course, is to learn the verbs, is AutoPkg help. It lists the verbs, tells you a little bit about it. If you want to learn about a verb, you just go AutoPkg, name of the verb, and like run, for example, and --help or just -h. When it's time to run a recipe, you can just run, let's say firefox.download, and it's there. And then, like I said, you can run with another verb. And I use list recipes here because it'll show up shortly as an example. My demo. Here's a slide from what I was going to regale you with this morning. And in this room, with the size of the screen, the people watching this on video later can see this much more clearly. So I guess that was actually a blessing in disguise. You'll still see about 3 minutes of the video, but there are the list of AutoPkg verbs for you. And you can see it's very straightforward. There's only just over a dozen of them. But if you have used AutoPkg and you haven't dabbled in the command line much, these next 3 slides will help. Again, I had a whole demo for it, but maybe you can just use it as a reference chart. You're all smart people. So the Update Recipes Now button and the Run Recipes Now button have exact equivalents at the command line. Same with when you check the box or uncheck the box to add a repo, you have a direct equivalent. I want to point out the one for running the selected recipes now. AutoPkg, one of its nice features is by checking those little boxes, it creates a recipe list. All that recipe list is a list line by line of recipe names. AutoPkg at the command line can use that. It understands that, and you just use the -L option, or if you prefer, --recipe-list, if that is more meaningful to you. And I've shown the location there of where the AutoPkg recipe list is. And again, for those of you who have used AutoPkg before, there's again some direct equivalencies there, because AutoPkg is just running AutoPkg under the hood. Going from the bottom up, AutoPkg search is the easiest one. And in fact, they added that as a later feature because people were conflating it with the 1-2 up right above the, oh, actually I can do this, sorry. They were conflating it with this one, woohoo, sexy, that was only filtering the recipes you had already downloaded. So that's why there's a lovely, you can take advantage of grep to do that, to list the recipes and then filter them for the ones you already have downloaded in the repos. And if you want to, there are recipe repos outside of the project, and you can just arbitrarily type in the path. In fact, it's about equally difficult or easy, if you want to put it, on both user interfaces. There are also contextual menu commands that are sensible in AutoPkg, and there's a list of the common ones, the ways you can make them equivalent. Obviously, the first three are the most common, and they're dead simple. They make perfect sense, right? So, let's see how we am for time. Ooh, 2 minutes ahead. Fantastic. Reading and writing recipes. This is the meat of what we're going to do so for those of you who wanting to level up, and there was plenty of you who hadn't written recipes, hopefully this will be helpful. Again, I'm going to be a pedagogue. Some of you might say a pedant, but let's just make sure we're talking the same page technology-wise. And for those of you who haven't used AutoPkg before, understand that it's all based on recipes. So just like this lovely recipe I would have for a self-saucing fudge dessert, recipes have components. They have a name, they show the ingredients, and you have a list of instructions. In AutoPkg, we have the same thing. We have a name, an identifier for the recipe, input, just like you have ingredients, it's like what variables do you want to use? Do you want to specify for values? And then process, and that's where the work gets done. Those, it's like, put your ingredients in a bowl, stir. Well, this is what AutoPkg does, and I'm sure those of you who have used it a lot, that's second nature to you. But for those of you who haven't, understand that AutoPkg recipes are the core of the product. It's a series of steps or processors in a MacAdmin-friendly format forplists. You can leverage other recipes because you can call a recipe, can say, run this recipe and then do these steps. And that's called a parent-child relationship in the documentation. I know that's how I got started. My .ds family of recipes, originally envisioned for Deploy Studio usage, just took everyone else's work and said, oh, you got a package recipe? Let me copy that to my Deploy Studio repo. That's all it did. But I was able to leverage everyone else's. It's fantastic. And even though I could have, and you still can, write a recipe from top to bottom that does everything you need, best practice is to be modular. Can you think of another thing where it's a best practice not to use something monolithic and instead be modular? Yeah, you might. But basically, this also allows us to leverage one of the core values of AutoPkg. You'll see it right on the README. It's about sharing, right? It's right in the, if you will, the manifesto of the product, that it's about sharing recipes with each other so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So the first thing you want to do before you, and obviously most of you have, is check to see if the recipe already exists. Those are the standard locations. There are in fact 100 now repos in the project, contributed by various people. I'm one of them, and I'm, it's like all you do is you develop your own repo in GitHub, and when you think you have something to share, you ask the project maintainers, can I be added to the project? And then it becomes available through the AutoPkg search function. They're generally really good about that. Sometimes it takes a while because it's not their day, not their day job, but they've been very good about it. Having said that, there are also recipes outside the actual AutoPkg repo. Some people have private repos, like people in Facebook. Apparently, they even have Git-controlled repos of their own that aren't publicly available, and then the stuff they're willing to give publicly available, they open source. You can get at, all they would do is they would just provide the straight URL to it, and then AutoPkg is happy to use it. Since Greg Nagel did the talk here in 2014, you ought to check out AutoPkg, and for those of you who have never used it and want to use it at the command line, that's still a great basic introduction to the basic features. He, at the presentation, that column on the left there, that's what he was doing. That's what he said for the recipe count. We're now over in the column on the right, we're in big numbers. And in fact, I use that downloads number to give you an idea of how many processes you actually have, how many products you're actually supporting. That's a lot. Someone has probably already written the recipe. Having said that, I frequently encounter times where I'm in such of a vertical market supporting visual and performing artists that sometimes that's not the case. You'll notice the people who use Monkey, it's one of the most popular things for them, but people have also built support for other management systems in. Like I said, the .ds is mine, so those 41 recipes are almost all mine. In fact, I think they're all mine, but you're more than welcome to build them. So you can incorporate AutoPkg into your work, whether you use one of these management systems, you could even potentially build it, or in fact, you just use it to build packages that you then manually put into your system. But if you want to automate, there are other options as well. So, what's the best way to create a recipe? Well, I'm sure most of you who said you hadn't written recipes, you may have tried this. That's how we all did it. That's how I still do it sometimes. The only trick will be finding a good recipe to model, to know whether you've got someone who is really up to the latest, using all the latest processors and stuff. But you can certainly leverage the code of others. I mentioned the 2014 Hack-A-Mac at MacBrained. Recipe Robot, by some of the same people, was a product of the 2015 Hack-A-Mac at MacBrained Bay Area. I'm starting to use this tool a little more and more. Of course, chicken and the egg, you can still do it that way if you want. I think Per Olsen, who wrote the original code, and then maybe Greg Nagel, might have written a recipe straight from scratch, just at the, just typing, probably in, I don't even get into which terminal editor they would have used, but maybe they used something like BBEdit, which you'll see in a couple of later demos, but yeah. You probably will not use the third one. I don't think I have. I've written steps manually, but not otherwise. Again, my much mourned demo. And you'll notice, however, this is an example of I had to write a recipe, or I was asked to deploy NVivo 12. I deployed NVivo 11 before, but hey, new version. Sometimes recipes work cross versions. Sometimes because of the way the distributor or the vendor does it, you have to write a new recipe for each version, because at some arbitrary point they change the methodology of how they distribute their updates or their product. So I did a search for NVivo, and Auto, as you can see on the right-hand side, or if you can read it at all, AutoPkg search NVivo is what I typed, and it came up with 2 recipes plus my repo, or sorry, 2 repos plus mine that had recipes. You can ignore the one that's mine. That was a result of me preparing for this talk and doing the talk. That's a kind of like if you've ever seen a cooking show where it's say, bake 30 minutes. Oh, and here's the 30-minute later version. That's the 30-minute later version. So if you want spoilers, go ahead. Otherwise, start where I started, where it was, we've got 2 sets of repos. Let's take a look at one of the recipes. I'm curious to see if you can read this. Yeah, pretty close. How many of you have actually gone ahead and, especially if you've never used a product, how many of you have looked at the code or the markup in a recipe? Okay, so that's most of you. So this will not look unfamiliar to you. Let me make it at least a little more readable. Every recipe has parts, and I described that, but to be more specific, obviously has the doc type definition for a plist, XML file, has a description that tells you what the recipe does. That's a courtesy. It doesn't actually run anything. Has a unique identifier. Every recipe must have a unique identifier. There's a standard form, com.github.your GitHub username dot the type of recipe, like package or download, and then the name of the product. It doesn't have to be that, but that's a very easy way to get a unique recipe. Then below that, input. Those are like variables you want to use elsewhere in the recipe, and ideally, if you're going to put it in input, you want to be able to override it, or i.e. put in your own values. You don't have to, but things you put in there, as a recipe writer, expect that someone's going to put in their own value. The minimum version of AutoPkg that you need, if you want to be safe right now running your own recipes, 1.0.0 would be the value there, because there haven't been any new processors introduced since then, but there was at least one introduced at 1.0.0. So that will be the last one that would cover everything. And then the section where it says process, that's the meat of it. And as you can see in this one, there are two processors, URL downloader, which guess what that does, and end of check phase. And end of check phase is when at the command line you go AutoPkg run and you give the check only option. It will actually stop there, and at the command line it'll report rather than actually download. So it's actually good practice once you're finished downloading to add an end of check phase step to your recipe so that someone who's using the check functionality doesn't have to do any of the other steps in the recipe. We're just checking to see if it was updated. So yeah, that was a little hard to read, so here's kind of the summarized down version. Those are the key value pairs in the plist. And for the process, there are two processors. So that was that one I showed you was the recipe of Josh Miller. In fact, you might have met him at the registration desk or heard him give the 30-second here's for the day type talk today. And so I looked at, he had this recipe for 10, he had another recipe for 11, and all that happened was the URL changed. And in fact, this vendor uses a static URL so that when they release a new point version, it uses the same URL. They just change the file that you're downloading. So that makes it an actually excellent recipe to start with because it's easy. You don't need anything to figure out what the URL is. You can just specify it in the recipe directly. I then looked at the other one, the other repo that had a NVivo 11 recipe, and it was from a guy whose handle was NZ Mac Geek, and I use Z because Z stands for, or if you prefer Z, stands for New Zealand, and that's how they'd say it, just like I would, Z. You get everything from Canada here today. And so I looked at his recipe, and I know it's a him because his name's William, and there are two processors in there. Curl downloader. Anyone know what the story is behind curl downloader? There's a prize for it if you do. No? So what happened was early in the AutoPkg project, they didn't use curl to download using URL downloader. But they started having some problems so that they tested out, they created a new processor, curl downloader, that used curl. Eventually they decided, this solves all the problems, and I think it was to do with security, like TLS. So they decided, okay, curl fixes that. We're now going to use curl in the URL downloader process. So now we have two processors that do the same thing. So this was a person who was using essentially the best practice at the time they wrote it, and this recipe is about 3 years old, right? You know what the code is for curl downloader now? It's deprecated, by the way. Look in the code. It says, run URL downloader. Go for the processor, right? So if I were cleaning up this recipe, I would change it to URL downloader. But The other step that they've put in here is AppDMG versioner. What's that? How do we find out? Because the URL downloader is pretty straightforward, right? Well, there's a command in AutoPkg called processor info, and I mentioned that up top, where you can just type that in and type in the processor name. Sadly, it has to be exact, but you can list the processors and find out and just copy and paste if you like. And this is what it describes. And so all it's doing is it's taking an app that's part of a disk image that you downloaded and pulling version information, and all it's doing is it's populating some variables that you can then use later in a later recipe. For
Version of the app, not the version of the OS it runs.
So, yes, that's the version of the app, version information of the app bundle, not the OS. So whatever it's trying to scan information about the app itself that you might want to use, for example, when packaging, because one of the common things in a package recipe is to append the version number on it. I have a philosophical position. You do not have to adopt it. Here's my position. You should not do anything in a download recipe you don't need to do. If you want version information for your package recipe, put the version or processor in your package recipe, especially because we're building it modularly. I'm from an era where processor cycles were scarce. I like my code to run lighter rather than doing redundant work. This is why I'm putting out the religious forewarning. In this case, if I was going to use the AppDimage versioner processor or its cousin, versioner, I would put it in the package recipe. I've been informed by reliable sources that Monkey doesn't need this. And so people who are developing recipes with Monkey would generally not put that in their recipe anyway. But sometimes it's, vendors have packages that don't use good information or don't follow standards, so that's why the processor exists. But I wouldn't have put it in the download recipe. Okay, so end rant. Take what you like and leave the rest on that one. So I could just go in and model my recipe for an NVivo 12 after those ones, because I went down to the web page, and I had a lovely demo of that too, and I got the link, and it's the same thing, it's a fixed link. In fact, in the course of me testing, they actually did an update, so I know it worked, right? It's the same link both times. But today, I'd like to show you, and I will show you demo, how to use Recipe Robot. There's the link for it, and if you want to learn much more about using Recipe Robot, Elliot Jordan and Shay Craig gave a talk, and probably I think it was either in this room or the next room, from 2016 that goes into it in depth, including how you can use it at the command line if you prefer. And you'll see why that might make sense in a moment. So rather than talk anymore, let me just show you. So after you set up the basic settings, including, from me, com.github.jazzace, I just paste it in the link. This is sped up, by the way. It actually downloads the software, checks it, finds out what it is, it's an app. I had checked boxes for make me a download and a package recipe. It did that. It's done. Yes, I sped it up, but it's really that simple. So I looked at the recipe, and I'm going to give you that summary view this time again, rather than put up code that you can't see. It created a description for me, the standard description for a download recipe. It gave it an identifier. It used my GitHub ID, Jazzace, because I told it to. It created 2 input keys, the download URL and the name, so that means they're overridable. For the reasons I expressed earlier, 1.0.0 is set up at the minimum version of AutoPkg needed to run this recipe. And then it used 4 processors. What the heck is that? URL downloader, end of check phase, we saw those. Code signature verifier, haven't seen that yet, and versioner. I told you about versioner is a cousin of AppDimage version. That's a spoiler. You might know what's going to happen coming up soon. But code signature verifier, again, what's that? That leads us to really what's going to be the bulk of this talk. And for those of you who have been using AutoPkg or AutoPkg without this, now is the kind of time to change. Oh, right on time. Fantastic. Trust. How many of you saw Greg Nagel's session yesterday? Okay. How many of you got rickrolled? Okay. Congratulations. I saw a sheepish hand. I had breakfast you this morning. Welcome, gift from Canada. That is a USB stick from the conference I helped organize, Mac deployment. We reformatted it for Mac. It's clean. Trust me. So this is one of those things where, yes, Rick put up, Rick rolled. Rick Roll, that'll be his new name now. Greg put up a QR code. That was great. And encouraged people to put their phone up, and it played Never Gonna Give You Up, right? On the link, right? So the question is, who do you trust, right? Are you gonna put that USB stick in that laptop? You can, but that's okay. Or maybe you'll just do it in a test machine or in a VM so that no damage will come. But one of the things is, how do users generally trust what they're installing now that it's not coming on a CD or a floppy disk? How do they trust what they're installing? Well, maybe they got it from the App Store or a vendor website, or heaven forbid, Mac update cached download, right? There's different levels of trust there, right? Of whether it is what it purports to be. Did you get what you expected? Was it corrupted? Is it signed? So for a user perspective, Gatekeeper is useful for that, right? It says this is what it should be. Is it virus-free? Did you download it using HTTPS so that there would be no man-in-the-middle type attack that could affect your download? If you have a package installer, we as MacAdmins can examine the package using something like Suspicious Package or Pacifist, if you like, and you can see what it does. But for the regular user, it's more about source. And of course, with a drag-and-drop app or something that comes from the App Store, you're not doing that install. It's being done for you, essentially. So then the other thing that you have to remember is, will the app do bad things? MacKeeper. And then for those that were drag and drop type installers, will the first run of an app actually do bad things? So for those people general users, if you limit yourself to the App Store or just vendors that you completely trust, you've got verification built in, right? All these steps are kind of covered, and I think that's what Apple's intent is. But for you as MacAdmins, it's all about your experience, right? It's what are you personally going to trust? I had the pleasure of having Tom Bridge come to my city and help present a workshop as part of the conference I mentioned. And this was back in 2016 when we were still, running AutoPkg like the Wild West. And someone very astutely in the audience said, why do you trust, how do you trust someone's recipes? Right? And Tom gave a good answer for the time and gave some details, but part of it boiled down to that at the time, Tom only ran recipes of people that he personally knew. That's a kind of trust, right? If you were in Jesse Peterson's session yesterday morning, he described that as a web of trust. I trust you, they trust them, now I have a ability to trust the other person, because that's someone who trusts I trust, and you build a kind of web of trust. In fact, the AutoPkg project is very much like that. But that means you also have to trust that what you're automating won't do bad things, right? And so Elliot Jordan, who was involved in both AutoPkg and is actively involved in the maintenance of Recipe Robot, because that is a tool that is currently maintained, did these 3 talks. I know I got a chance to watch a video stream of the Mac DevOps 2016 talk, where he raised 15 different ways you could do bad things with AutoPkg. Some more likely than others, but if you want to, I encourage you to watch, if you're going to watch one of these talks, watch the more recent one from MacAdmins here last year. And that's because it incorporates something that the AutoPkg project added between his last 2 talks there on this topic. AutoPkg 1.0 added 3 new verbs. Now, Audit highlights the recipe issues that could allow bad things to happen, many of which may be okay, but should be verified by you. So, when you to audit recipes now in version 1.0 and later, you just type AutoPkg audit and the name of the recipe. You may have more than one recipe. You can have it just, put a space, type a second recipe in, put a space, type a third recipe in, as long of a list of recipes as you want, and it will check it. For those of you who are AutoPkg users, you already have a recipe list, and just like I showed earlier in the presentation, you can use that same reference to your recipe list to audit your recipes. And there I've shown you the longer form rather than -L for the option flag. So in preparation for this presentation, I said, well, I don't think I've run audit on my recipes. I should do that. Yikes. 8 with audit issues. Okay, so then I went and used, since my recipe's in GitHub, that I used that. Then checked all my recipes by replacing download with an asterisk and globbing all the recipes. And I came up with 65 recipes that I've written. 49 have audit issues and 16 were clean. Now understand that doesn't mean I have 49 recipes that need changing, but it suggests I should check them at least once. And here's an example. I used in my Pro Video Formats recipe a non-core processor written by Nate Felton. Nate will be actually presenting tomorrow morning at the conference. He wrote something where you take the number, the Apple number for a support download, a 4-digit number, put it in as an input key in your override, and voila, it downloads what's part of that page. Well, I leveraged what he was having downloaded, which was mostly like updates to particular products, and I said, hey, I can use that. That works for like the Pro Video Format stuff that I need for deploying Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro. And so this message is saying, do you trust Nate's code? Have you audited it? I've checked it. I've run it. It does nothing malicious. This is just fine, right? So this is a flag that I should check it, but an audit will flag it every single time I run audit, but there's nothing to see here because I've checked it. I trust it, move on. Oh, TouchOS editor. Now that's a real vertical thing. I doubt anyone in the room runs it. That's why I had to write the recipe for it, right? Because no one else is. 3 things here. The last 2 are HTTP URLs. It's saying you should check to see if there's HTTPS. Lo and behold, not only has this vendor changed to HTTPS since I wrote the recipe, they actually redirect all their HTTP traffic to HTTPS. So putting S into, twice into this recipe, hitting save, got rid of those warnings. I run another audit on it, and it's only missing code signature verifier. Hey, there's that processor again, the one we saw that Recipe Robot automatically created. So this is an important check where you're going to begin your trust or verifying trust other than just what you trust using code signature verifier. This is written by Hannes Jutelainen from Finland. He has contributed to various projects in the community, and he was probably the first person to raise flags about trust issues. He wrote this. He also wrote a processor that's in the core processors called VirusTotal. I can't remember what the other word is, but it lets you scan, after you've downloaded everything, scan your recipes for viruses, or your downloads for viruses. So you can incorporate that if you like, if you use their engine. Code signature verifier, it's to check the integrity of the app or package installer, right? Packages are signed, it can check for the signature to make sure it matches what it expects. Depending on whether it's an app or a package, you do that separately, right? You can just run a simple command at the code line, and if you're like me, who types like they never learned to touch type because, yeah, we'll not go into why the gray hair says I never took typing. But I will just type the front part of it, and where you see the italics, which is where you would put in the path, I generally find the app, drag and drop it onto the terminal. It types the exact path for me, just hit return, and we're good to go. Unlike stuff that's in the command in AutoPkg, for these commands, since they're not part of AutoPkg, you do need to, for example, if it's a disk image, mount the disk image and then drag the app, or specify the path to the app, in that case, volumes, disk image name, product.app. So let's clean up that recipe, that TouchOSC recipe that had the problem. So I run it, I did the drag and drop, and I got this output. And you'll see a big chunk of stuff right at the bottom there. That's what we need for an app signature. Note that for package ones, it's different, but it's easy to find a model either in the wiki or in someone's recipe repo to figure out what to do. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to take the code signature verifier, and we're going to put the value for that we just got, put it into the value for the requirement part of the recipe. So let's get back to our recipe. We're back to the demo again. But this time you're actually going to see video. Can you believe it? By the way, the demo that died on the editing table, I'm hoping to post that later on my as part of my blog or as a repo, so it won't die. But here's the recipe, and I don't know how well you can read it, but you'll notice that the recipe that Recipe Robot generated looks like it did the code signature verification for us. So if you really don't like banging away at the command line to get those code signatures, especially, for example, like a package installer, looks like Recipe Robot will do it for you. Fantastic. We like that. But you'll also notice, as I mentioned before, there's a versioner processor in there. Oh, and extra note, you'll notice down at the bottom there, you'll notice in this section, in each dictionary, they've chosen to make it so that the processor name is last. It doesn't matter. It can be first or last. For me, it's more human readable if the processor is first and then the arguments are second, but there is no functional difference. It's simply a matter of style. Okay? So let's go on and edit the recipe. So I'm going to go and I'm going to get rid of versioner for reasons. You can leave it in if you like. I'm then going to scroll back up, and I have another religious war to fight, the download URL. If it's in the input key, that means if the URL changes, person with an override has to change their override. If I hard-code it into the recipe, that means, number one, I'm responsible for maintaining it, but B, when I change it, that makes that change available to everyone else. So I've chosen to put it in the actual recipe and get rid of the key, save the recipe, and there's a special location in the AutoPkg library AutoPkg in the user's account called recipes. Not automatically created if you set up with AutoPkgr, but any recipe that goes in there, you can use the short form when you type in AutoPkg run recipe, like recipe name dot, in this case, download, nvivo12.download. So that's saved, and as you can see, I also did an AutoPkgr thing. The point to note here is, if you do something at the command line and then go back into AutoPkgr while it's still open, you may have to quit and open up for it to see something that's happened. Some things get updated, some things don't. So if you're like me and I actually do work in both, you just have to be aware of that. And there's the download recipe that we just created, and it's in the search path, which means I can run it. Now, as you can see, there's a contextual menu, right-click if you prefer, or control-click. I can run this recipe, I can create an override, all those type of things. So I'm creating a recipe, time to test. I'm going to test at the command line. And the reason I'm going to do that is it gives me lots more information, especially for debugging, because I can't remember the last time I ran a recipe that worked exactly how I wanted the first time. So that's the syntax. You'll notice I've put a -VV. You may put as many V's as you like. The level of V, the number of V's you put in is the level of verbosity. I'm a particular fan of 2 V's for debugging recipes. It's enough information, but without all the clutter. You can, however, you don't have to have your recipe in the search path. You can literally drag and drop the recipe into the terminal to give the full path, or just type it out, but understand that if you specify a full path rather than the abbreviated one, you must add the .recipe on the end, because it's just going to treat it as a Unix path, not go look at the short form. Okay, so just be aware of that. Okay, let's go back to the video demo. So I'm going to clear the terminal. I'm going to run it with verbosity, and yes, there's going to be a time lapse here. I'm going to speed it up a bit. So it goes, it downloads it. Okay, fine, it does a code signature verifier check, and we're done. Yes, it took longer than that. But that's great. It's already downloaded, and it's done what it's needed to do. So I'm just going to copy that location in the Finder, because it tells me where it is, and I'm just going to use the go to Finder command because I like the GUI. There's another way that I'll show you later that most of you, don't tell me. I know you know how to do it. So I just copy and pasted that URL in, and voila. There's our disk image. It's done it for us. This is clearly working. So now it's time to edit the package recipe. Oh, sorry, yeah, I did skip something. Okay, let's go back. I'll let the video run. You'll see at the bottom there, what I did was I ran it a second time. And when I ran it a second time, I just used bang, bang, 2 exclamation marks to just run the same command again. When I'm developing recipes, if it works the first time, that's great, but I also need to test what happens when I've already downloaded it and there are no updates, right? So that's why my final test will always be run it twice. I'll delete the cache to make sure I'm getting a fresh run on a final test. I will then run it, and then I will run it again. And then if I get the download the first time and I get nothing, what you see up there, nothing downloaded, packaged, or imported, then we've succeeded. Okay, now back to the rest of the demo. So I'm now going to edit the package recipe. So I'm going back into user library, AutoPkg, and you'll notice the convention. The convention is to use the vendor's name as the folder to organize your recipes. You can only go 1 deep. But there's the recipe for the package. You'll notice that it adds the parent recipe processor. It says go run downloads, but it just says app package creator. That's all I need. So I'm just going to save that recipe into recipes so I can run it, right? Nothing to change there, no parameters. It adds a bundle ID input key, but that's it. So let's just close that up, go to the terminal, and because I like saving my typing strokes, I'm just going to use an up arrow, get the last command, delete .download, and put in .package, and just run it again. This one's actually at, it downloads it again because I'm running a package recipe. Okay, beware of that, so that every time you run from a different child recipe, it will recreate the cache. So know that for testing. But look, it appears to have not only, it reports that it's built a package and that, of course, it downloaded the disk image to start with. Again, a successful recipe. Now, remember my versioner rant? If you look up there carefully in the top right-hand corner there, you'll see the version number, actually. It says 12.1 zip. So We didn't need versioner. The app package processor was able to package it up and grab the information it needed. So that would have been redundant work. Okay, let's look at what else. So let's look at what we created now. Here's that. Oh, hey, let's go into the Finder. Again, I'll use the go command, but you'll see that. Go to folder, just paste it in because I hate typing this stuff. And voila, there's the package that it generated from the app. You can see that it downloaded, just like the previous episode, built a package, went from that disk image, mounted it, copied the app so that it could build a package, and then put a receipt down. The receipt is essentially, I think it's of 3 or 4 levels of verbosity set as an XML file. So if you ever want to check on why a recipe went bad, there is always a receipt after every run. Fantastic, right? You got everything there. You can audit. Very useful for when you're building recipes. So in summary, this is what we got for the package recipe. More verbose description. It put the identifier in. Bundle ID, which was needed for building the package, it put in as a variable. And you'll notice that for input keys, they get inherited. You don't actually have to state a variable to inherit it. So you'll see some of my package recipes, for example, will have an empty dictionary in input because all the variables, if there were any, were in the download recipe. I don't need to re-specify them. You may, but I don't, because I don't want to accidentally walk on a value that came in through the other recipe. That slide's actually slightly in error. The original one that Recipe Robot had download URL as something that would get inherited, but as you saw in my version, I got rid of it. And so, very simple in that regard. It calls the parent and then runs all those steps and then creates a package using App Package Creator. And App Package Creator was released with 1.0.0, so that is why the minimum version has to be 1 for AutoPkg. And that's also why when you look to build a package recipe, that processor is the bomb. If you ever see some of the older recipes, including some in my repo, there are like 4 processors you have to run to build the package. You have to say, okay, establish this is where the package is going to be, put things here, set the permissions, and now package that. If you need that flexibility, the packager processor is fantastic for that. But for most of you, that will be the processor you want to use. Ooh, we're ahead. Fantastic. Every time you see the cube transition, that's a time check for me. That's a section check. Because I talked about auditing your recipes, and I talked about code verification. But the next big thing was trust verification that came in with version 1.0. And these are the 2 verbs that help run that, plus support in the code base. Greg Nagel, who, many of you saw yesterday, was on the MacAdmins podcast way back on episode 15, just before this feature was released, while it was still being finalized. And he said on that podcast something that I think is useful in describing what this is about. He said, quote, "Trust may have actually not been the best word to use for this feature because it implies something, but the trust is actually the admin. The admin has decided, I'm going to trust this as is. Then, when it changes, the admin has to look at it again to decide, once again, do I want to trust these changes?" End quote. So the idea is this is meant to prevent bad things from happening because you're using recipes that aren't yours and then you've just updated them without checking. Or even just you're using recipes that aren't yours. Or, hey, maybe someone's GitHub recipe repo got compromised. This is a way to check when things have changed and gives you the opportunity to verify those changes. How many of you are in the MacAdmins Slack? I would presume almost all of you. If not, there's actually a link in the slides to tell you how to join, because I know we just assume everyone is now. But macadmins.org, go there, join the Slack. The most common question we were getting in the AutoPkg channel, because there is an AutoPkg channel, was I'm getting these fail recipes without trust info. Some people would call them warnings, some people would call them errors, to the point where if you type that variable name into the Slack channel, you get this bot response. Because it was so common. So I knew when I was planning this talk, I had to talk about this topic. Friends, it's a warning. Things will continue to run if you personally trust everything. They will continue to run. You actually have to turn this feature on for it to intentionally stop working. There are actually, if you want to think of it, 3 possible values for fail recipes without trust info. Not set at all, a Boolean true or a Boolean false. If you want to turn on trust info, and I strongly recommend that you do, that's the default's right command for you to use. You can also do it on a per run basis using the -k flag if you like. Now, when we're developing recipes, we really need to ignore trust info because there's really no functional way to develop a recipe while trust is on. So you can, when you're testing, you can either persistently turn off recipes by just reversing the effects of that default right command by setting it to no, or just deleting that key entirely so that it is not set. And I'm only being pedantic about this because when I was researching this talk, we found out that if you wanted to override it on a per run basis, and that's quite frankly the method I'm going to start using going forward because I would continually forget to turn trust back on after I was testing a recipe, right? And I want to run with trust on all the time. This allows you to, this string I've got here allows you to run it at the command line on a per run basis with the -k flag. Anyone notice anything strange about the particular syntax on that or how we set the value? Wouldn't you expect to just say no there at the end instead of double quote, double quote? What we found out was the -k option only knows text. It only knows strings. It can't set a Boolean value that way. So Greg Nagel in the AutoPkg channel suggested, why don't you, how about try this? Try with the double quotes. And that worked. So what we found out was, if the value is unset on run, it will ignore trust info. If you try to set it with the -k flag, it will take the presence of text as true or yes, and will run with trust info. So it's just one of those things you find out about the project that even one of the writers of the code didn't know at the time when you get in and dig deep into these things. It's kind of fun. So hopefully that'll be easier to read than some of the other things we've had, which is fantastic. So I ran the recipe with verbosity, and you'll notice with trust on, after I set it to on, and instead of running that same recipe that we just had succeed, it said, yeah, there's no trust information. It then tells you exactly what to do. Make an override. Again, for those of you who are brand new to AutoPkg, and even for those of you who aren't, when you use a recipe, even your own, you should override all your recipes. I know you've probably seen this meme before, and I went to the trouble of actually finding the source. In the same comic or web page, I think this is much more appropriate for us. Basically, for overrides, you want to even if it's your recipe, you want to override it because one of the things in version 1.0 and later of AutoPkg is that trust information is automatically added to the override. So that's where it does the check. If you don't have an override, it can't do the trust check. So those of you who haven't used overrides or are new to AutoPkg, the function of a recipe override is allowed to you to put in your own values for those input keys that I suggested. So for example, one popular way might be, I have a product, I want to specify which major version because the recipe allows that. And so in an input key, I put 12. In fact, the in vivo recipe that is in my repo allows you to put in an input key of 10, 11, or 12, and that is the version that it will download because it's a simple URL and it was not hard for me to customize the recipe like that. When you do an override, it will create its own unique identifier using the form local.recipiname.appname. And you can go in and change it, doesn't matter, but again, just like any other recipe, it needs to be unique. I think that's the other thing that you might want to know. Essentially, an override is a child recipe, that's something that calls another recipe, but has no process steps. It does nothing other than call the recipe. And substitute, obviously, whatever values you want for input keys. You can use shorthand, so when if I run that command again, AutoPkg run nvivo12.package, after I created the override like I did there, it will find the override because in its search path, overrides are first. That's important, especially if you're going and trying to fix a recipe or update a recipe you already have. You may need to set the override aside for a minute because it will search all overrides for your recipe name. Then it will search one of the places, that special recipes folder that I mentioned, and then the repos in the project. So understand that that's the hierarchy. And as I mentioned, starting in 1.0, you get trust information. So let's go back to the demo with trust enabled and create an override. Now you could create an override with AutoPkg, like I said, you saw with the command thing, and it actually has the one in AutoPkg has a benefit in that you can actually change that identifier. It actually prompts you. When you go create override, it actually prompts you what identifier you want to use. That's particularly useful for recipes where you may multiple override them. Like I have a Apple support article download recipe where you might want to specify different support articles. I mentioned Nate Felton's processor before. That's another example. So let's do it from the command line and back to live demo. So it gave me the command, AutoPkg, make-override recipe name. I run that. Fantastic, it's done. For those of you who are command line junkies, yes, I know that I can type open space and put the URL in and it'll open it in the Finder, or open to that location in the Finder. So, fine, I open the recipe, it's created its own unique ID. Fantastic. There are 2 input keys. That look familiar to anyone else? Especially the description above it, SHA-52 hash. So what it does is it takes each recipe in your chain, in this case, a download recipe and a package recipe, and hashes it. If something changes, it tells you. That's when it flags the warning. If you have trust turned on, it will actually prevent the recipe from running. If you are an AutoPkg user, you may turn this on at the command line, but when it fails, all the report you'll get in your run or in your email message or your notification will be that a recipe failed with trust information, right? That's one of the reasons why when something fails, you'll want to go to the command line to find out, to basically audit it, or even check the recipe receipt to find it. But if you're running it just manually in the GUI, it won't necessarily tell you what recipe it is. So quickly, let's just summarize the look of the override in the same format I've used before, note what isn't there more than what is there. No description, no minimum version, no processors. So, we're talking about trust and recipes and why would they change. So why would they change? Well, I've mentioned it. You're updating to a new version, right? The recipe author has made a change. Maybe your recipe's broken and you go check, oh, needs to be updated. Fine. In AutoPkg, we saw those buttons, right? Update all repos. And you can actually contextually click on a repo and say, update that repo. You know, when you see the little yellow button saying, yes, there's been changes, you can manually update that. Of course, you can do it at the command line as well. And as you can see, they're made to be very simple because that's something you're going to want to do on a fairly regular basis. Right? Just repo update all if you want to do that. And those of you who are AutoPkg users, you'll know that you have the ability to check a box that says before, if you do a scheduled run or a scheduled run, you have the option to say update the repo before. For me, because I still use the automation set up by AutoPkg for me, I check that box saying update before the run so that if the recipe's been updated, I want it to fail. Because I've got trust information turned on, and I want it to fail so that I can go back and check it. So there's two ways you can find out whether your recipes have failed. You can just run them and make sure that you've got the fail recipes without trust info flag set. Or you can use that other verb, one of the verbs we mentioned, the new verbs. You can literally verify the trust info, and if you want to, you can use a level of verbosity. Here's that command run. I don't know if you can read it with no verbosity. I just put AutoPkg verify trust info, name of the recipe, and it reports back name of the recipe failed or okay. So in this case, I said, well, this is an actual case from my system for one of the things I do on my personal machine. I then ran it again, but with verbosity. Notice something here? Because we're using GitHub, it does a diff between the one you have, the version you have on your computer, and the one that you, it knows how to compare the difference between the version you had and the version that they've downloaded, the version that the hash says you have. I'll put it that way, right? So that trust information says, this was the version that I trusted, but now there's a new version. And this is the change. And in this case, this was a shared processor version splitter by Elliot Jordan. And all he did was UTF-8 encode the text because there was a problem with that. So we just made a small improvement. He describes it at the bottom there. We're good to go. I'm willing to trust this. I could inspect it more, but that gives me all the information I need. So then I run the AutoPkg update trust info, that recipe name command, and what it does is it goes back to that override and updates the hashes. And in fact, it could be that the recipe chain actually changed in there. So it actually just re-updates the whole chain, right? So that becomes the rinse, lather, rinse, repeat cycle, if you will, that they suggest on the shampoo bottles. You set up, you trust your repo. You get to yourself to a spot where you trust everything you run. You turn trust info on. You update your repos. Something has changed. You figure out what's changed. You check it. You say, yes, I'm good with that, or maybe no, I'm not. But you say, yes, I'm good with that. Update trust info. Now you're back to maintained. That's the process. So, exactly what I figured. There's 6 minutes left. I have a bunch of little miscellaneous things, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer questions first, and if you have no questions, I have a prioritized list of what we might be able to get to in the last minute. So, since we have a lot of newbies and we might have questions, or maybe even from the experienced people, does anyone have any questions? Let's start here. And by the way, the miscellaneous stuff is all in the slide deck, so you'll get the information even if I don't talk about it.
So if you would like to capture, assuming it's even available, information about what OS is the application that you're trying to package up supports, is there an easy way to do that, or is that even supported?
No, it's not a function of the product, no. Yep.
I probably just missed something. What is the major difference between like the download recipe and the package recipe if the package recipe in your example was also re-downloading?
So the benefit here is you could write a recipe that says download it, extract the app, turn it into a package, right? And bundle it as a package so that I can use it. The download recipe, when I'm testing recipes, I want to isolate what I'm testing, right? So for me, all the package recipe does, it says run the download recipe, then package it.
Okay.
Right? So it's a chain, a parent-child relationship. Run this.
Okay.
Run this and run that. So that's why I tested both. I could have just gone right to the package recipe and tested it, but then it's like, where's the fail point?
Okay, gotcha.
Okay?
Thank you.
Fair enough? Great. Any other questions? At the back, of course. While the microphone goes back, can you come get, Eddie, pass it back or throw it back. I'll cover one of the miscellaneous things. This is one of the things that came up on the MacAdmins Slack. You can run, at the command line, you can run any recipe with the --package flag or -p, and that allows you to say, no, don't bother downloading it. I have the download already. Please do it. There's a couple examples. This is a good one where the terms of service of FOSS Hub say you cannot do automated downloads. It's against the terms of service. So you manually download it, you run the package recipe, but say, I've already got the download, here you go. And then it verifies it using code signature verification, bundles it in an installer package, and then you can have a child recipe that puts it into JSS, Monkey, et cetera, like that. So understand that's also very good for testing. If I didn't want to re-download that, I could have said, run the package recipe, but no, just here's the thing I downloaded 2 minutes ago if I have bandwidth issues. Thank you, your question.
So I've been using AutoPkg for a couple of years now, and one of the things that drives me crazy about it is when the trust info fails, which I've had turned on,
Yeah.
the logging is somewhat lacking, or at least the error messages that come up are lacking. Like, it often doesn't point out which package failed. Do you have any tips on best way to find that? Like, console is one way, but it's not great.
No, and I absolutely do. And it really is, it comes down, so what I would generally do is when it does exactly what you says, it just reports generically that trust info has failed. What I actually would do then is I would go go to the command line, AutoPkg, verify trust info, use the recipe list option and say run my AutoPkg recipe list and go, and not verbose, and it'll just go okay, 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 failed, okay, 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 failed. Oh, these two are the ones that I need to investigate.
Okay, great, I'll try that.
Yeah, so that's the most efficient way to do it. Question over there.
So that AutoPkg trust update command that you ran at the end there,
Yeah.
it didn't have like a yes or no identifier, so I assume it just says if you run that, then it's yes. Is there a way to untrust a package after the fact?
Way to what the package after?
Untrust it. So say, I really didn't mean to trust that package. I need to undo that.
So in this case, you're not trusting the package,
Or not
you're
the
trusting the recipe, right. You know, the easiest way is, well, no, all that does is update the trust info in the override.
Okay.
That update trust info literally takes the old trust info and replaces it with the current one. So I guess, I mean, if you really want to roll back, well, number one, if you've got this, it's not going to run because you've turned that on.
Okay.
Right? Any other questions? There's some resources for you, especially if you're new to AutoPkg. The wiki is very explicit, and if it's not, you're free to edit it, quite frankly, if you need more information. There is the AutoPkg channel in the MacAdmin Slack. That's the link to join. There's the AutoPkg discussion list if you want to be in more detail, and you can get everything from this session from there. Thanks, everyone.